New York in 1700 held fewer than 5,000 people. By centuries, and more than 60,000. The city began at the water's edge. In the early 17th century, a small Dutch settlement was established at the southern tip of Manhattan. From this trading post grew the town of New Amsterdam, later renamed New York in 1664. For decades it remained small, compact, and tightly built. Then came the 18th century. British rule reshaped the town. Fortifications expanded. Brick replaced wood. Markets, churches, and government buildings took permanent form. To accommodate growth, streets pushed northward. Houses rose 2 and 3 stories high. Narrow plots produced tall, closely packed buildings with steep roofs and simple facades. At the southern edge of the town stood Fort George. Built in the late 17th century, it guarded the harbor and served as a seat of British authority. From its walls, cannons overlooked the approaches to the city. Thanks to new advanced AI software, we can now recreate these scenes with unprecedented accuracy. By analyzing original 18th century maps, paintings, and engravings, we are able to show how New York is likely to have looked its buildings, streets, and waterfront, allowing us to step back more than 300 years and experience the city as New Yorkers once did. Looking south across Manhattan toward New York Harbor, you are seeing the entire city as it existed at the time. The settlement ends abruptly at the shoreline. At the southern tip of Manhattan stood Fort George. By the early 1700s, it was the most important military structure in the city. The fort occupied high ground overlooking the harbor. Its position allowed cannons to control every ship entering or leaving New York. This was the center of British authority in the colony. Fort George had evolved from earlier Dutch defenses. The original fortification dated back to 1625, built by the Dutch West India Company. After the English takeover in 1664, it was expanded, reinforced, and renamed. By the mid-18th century, Fort George was a complex of stone walls, earthworks, barracks, and parade grounds. Inside stood the governor's residence, administrative offices, and military storehouses. This was where colonial power was exercised and displayed. Directly in front of the fort lay the battery. In the 1700s, the battery was not a park. It was a working military platform lined with heavy guns. Rows of cannons face outward toward the harbor, forming the city's first line of defense. The shoreline here was irregular and narrow. Waves reached almost to the base of the fort's walls. There was no reclaimed land, no promenade, no open lawns. Today, this same location is Battery Park. The fort is gone. The cannons have been removed. The shoreline has been pushed hundreds of feet outward through land reclamation. Where soldiers once drilled and artillery once stood, pedestrians now walk beneath trees. Ferries depart where warships once anchored. What was once the edge of empire is now the edge of the city. From the Battery, the main road led north. This was Broadway. In the early 18th century, Broadway was not a wide avenue. It was a narrow, uneven street following the natural contours of the land. Buildings pressed close to the roadway on both sides. Along this street stood taverns, shops, private homes, and small inns. Many structures were still timber-framed, though brick construction was becoming more common after repeated fires. Broadway connected the fort to the rest of the town. Everything passed along this route: officials, merchants, laborers, carts, and livestock. At this time, the city extended only a short distance north of the fort. Beyond it lay fields, gardens, and open land. This was New York in the early 1700s, a fortified colonial town. Compact, controlled, and defined by its relationship to the harbor. Beyond the fortifications, the town began to thin. Streets gave way to open land, and one structure rose clearly above the rest. North of Fort George, the town's most prominent landmark was Trinity Church. The first Trinity Church was built in 1698. It stood at the intersection of Broadway and Wall Street. At the time, this was the northern edge of the settled town. The church was constructed of stone, with a tall spire rising above the surrounding rooftops. In a city where most buildings stood only 2 or 3 stories high, Trinity Church dominated the skyline. Its graveyard surrounded the structure. Rows of headstones marked the resting places of merchants, officials, and military officers. The cemetery remains in use today, making it one of the oldest surviving burial grounds in the city. The church marked an important boundary. Beyond Trinity Church lay Wall Street. In the early 1700s, Wall Street was not a financial center. It was a defensive barrier. The street followed the line of a wooden wall built by the Dutch in 1653. The wall was constructed to protect the settlement from attack and to mark the northern limit of the town. By the 18th century, the wall itself had been removed. The street remained. Along Wall Street stood modest houses, workshops, and small businesses. This was a mixed area, not yet a place of wealth or prestige. Today, Wall Street is lined with towering office buildings and financial institutions. In the 1700s, it was narrow, uneven, and residential. From here, streets branched outward in irregular patterns. New York had no grid at this time. Roads followed property lines, natural slopes, and older paths. This produced a dense network of winding streets in Lower Manhattan. Among them were Pearl Street, Stone Street, and Hanover Square. These streets were crowded with shops, warehouses, and taverns. Stone Street, paved in the 1650s, was one of the city's first cobbled roads. Uneven and often slick with mud and refuse. The buildings along these streets rose directly from the sidewalk. There were no setbacks. Upper stories often projected outward over the street below. This was the commercial core of early New York. Goods were stored, traded, and sold within a few hundred yards of the waterfront. The streets were busy throughout the day. Carts moved slowly through narrow passages. Pedestrians shared space with animals and wagons. This was the daily life of the colonial city. Compressed, noisy, and tightly enclosed. At the center of daily life stood the city's markets. In the early 18th century, New York's main public market was located near the waterfront, close to today's South Street. This was where food entered the city. Farmers arrived by boat from Long Island and New Jersey. Fishermen brought their catch directly from the harbor. Produce, meat, grain, and firewood were traded here each morning. The market buildings were simple structures. Open-sided sheds with wooden roofs, stalls were arranged closely together to maximize space. There were no refrigeration systems. Trade began at dawn and ended quickly. By midday, the market was largely cleared. Today, this area is part of the modern financial district. Glass towers now rise where open-air stalls once stood. The shoreline itself has moved outward, burying the original market sites beneath reclaimed land. Nearby stood the city's public slaughterhouse. Animals were driven through the streets to be butchered close to the water. Waste flowed into the harbor or nearby drains. These conditions shaped the city's layout. Smells, noise, and congestion were part of everyday life. Not far from the markets stood City Hall. The first City Hall of New York was completed in 1700. It stood at the intersection of Wall Street and Nassau Street. The building was modest by later standards. 2 stories tall. Brick construction with a simple pitched roof. Inside, the city's council met to govern the growing town. Courtrooms, offices, and public chambers shared the same structure. This building served multiple functions. It was a seat of government, a courthouse, and a meeting place. Public announcements were made outside its doors. Today, this location is occupied by the Federal Hall National Memorial. The original City Hall was demolished in 1812. Nothing of the structure remains above ground. From City Hall, Nassau Street ran south toward the harbor. It was lined with print shops, small businesses, and taverns. This street became a center for information and communication. Printers produced newspapers, legal notices, and advertisements. News from Europe often arrived weeks late, yet spread quickly through these streets. Together, the market, City Hall, and surrounding streets formed the civic heart of 18th century New York. This was where the city was fed, where it was governed, and where public life unfolded. But the town did not end here. Its institutions spread outward. Beyond Trinity Church, other religious buildings marked the expanding town. The Dutch Reformed Church remained one of the most influential institutions in New York. Its congregation traced its roots back to the city's Dutch origins. By the early 1700s, the Dutch Reformed Church stood on Garden Street, today's Exchange Place. The building was constructed of stone with a steep roof and modest tower. Services were conducted in Dutch well into the 18th century. Nearby stood the Lutheran Church, serving German immigrants who had settled in the city. Its structure was smaller, simpler, and built to accommodate a growing congregation of craftsmen and laborers. These churches reflected the city's mixed population. English, Dutch, German, African, and Caribbean communities lived within a compact area. Religious buildings were among the few permanent stone structures in the town. Around them spread residential streets. Homes near the harbor were small and tightly packed. Many were built directly against one another, sharing walls. Wealthier merchants occupied brick houses closer to Broadway and Wall Street. Poorer residents lived nearer to the docks. Here, buildings were often wooden and more vulnerable to fire. Multiple families frequently shared a single structure. Upper stories extended over the street. Windows were narrow, light was limited. There were no paved sidewalks. Streets were uneven and frequently muddy. Rainwater, refuse, and animal waste flowed along shallow channels. At night, the city was dark. Only a small number of oil lamps illuminated major streets. Most movement after sunset was limited. Taverns provided light, warmth, and gathering spaces. Social divisions were visible in the layout of the town. The wealthy lived closer to Broadway. The working population clustered near the waterfront. Enslaved Africans lived and worked throughout the city, often housed in small rear buildings or shared quarters. By 1703, nearly 1 in 5 New Yorkers was enslaved. Their labor supported households, docks, and construction projects. Their presence shaped daily life, though they left few physical traces. Today, these residential streets are buried beneath modern office blocks and transit tunnels. The scale has changed completely. What once felt crowded now appears compressed by comparison. Yet, the street patterns remain. Many modern roads still follow these early paths. This was the living fabric of 18th century New York. Dense, functional, and constantly evolving. Its edge was defined by water. Along the eastern edge of the town lay the docks. In the early 1700s, New York's waterfront ran roughly along today's Pearl Street. The shoreline was irregular, shaped by natural coves and small inlets. Piers extended only short distances into the water. The docks were built of wood. They were narrow, crowded, and constantly in need of repair. Storms, tides, and ship traffic wore them down quickly. Small shipyards operated along the waterfront. Here, vessels were repaired rather than built. Hull planks were replaced, rigging mended, and cargo holds cleaned. Warehouses lined the shore. These were simple brick or timber structures with wide doors facing the water. Goods were unloaded directly from ships into storage. There were no cranes. Cargo was moved by hand. Barrels were rolled. Bales were carried on backs and carts. This waterfront was the city's economic engine. Everything passed through it: food, building materials, tools, textiles, and fuel. The area was noisy and crowded. Workers shouted instructions. Animals pulled carts through narrow gaps. Ships' bells and rigging filled the air. Today, this entire shoreline lies far inland. Land reclamation during the 19th century pushed the waterfront hundreds of feet eastward. The original docks now sit beneath streets and buildings. From the docks, the town extended north. By the mid-18th century, the northern boundary of New York lay near today's Chambers Street. Beyond it, the city ended. Fields, pastures, and small farms stretched northward across Manhattan. Scattered houses stood along dirt roads. There were no continuous streets. This boundary marked a clear divide. South of it lay the city. North of it lay open land. Occasionally, travelers passed through this area on their way to Harlem or beyond. The roads were rough and poorly maintained. Journeys were slow. This edge of town would not last. As population increased, houses began to appear beyond the boundary. Gardens were subdivided. Fields were sold and built upon. But in the early 1700s, the line was clear. New York remained a compact colonial town, defined by water, walls, and streets that followed no plan beyond immediate need. Within those limits, civic life began to organize itself. As the town grew, public institutions began to take shape. Education in early 18th century New York was limited. Formal schools were few and small. Instruction often took place in private homes or church buildings. In 1754, King's College was founded. It stood north of the settled town near today's City Hall Park. This institution would later become Columbia University. At the time of its founding, the college stood on open ground. There were no surrounding streets. Students studied at the edge of the city, separated from its noise and congestion. Nearby stood the almshouse. The first almshouse was built in 1736. It housed the poor, the sick, the elderly, and those unable to work. This was one of the city's earliest social institutions. The building was simple and functional. Brick walls, small windows, minimal decoration. Disease was a constant threat. Yellow fever, smallpox, and other illnesses spread easily through the crowded town. There was no modern sanitation system. Clean water was scarce. The city's hospital facilities were limited. Most care took place at home. Public health infrastructure would not develop until much later. Alongside these institutions stood taverns. Taverns were among the most important social spaces in the city. They served food, drink, lodging, and news. Business was conducted at their tables. Many taverns doubled as meeting halls. Political discussions took place here. Announcements were posted on their doors. One of the most notable was the Queen's Head Tavern. Located near the waterfront, it attracted merchants and sailors. Here, deals were made and information exchanged. These spaces connected the city. They linked merchants to laborers, officials to citizens, visitors to residents. Today, none of these early taverns survive. Their locations are marked only by street names and records. Modern buildings occupy their sites, yet their role was central. They were the living rooms of the colonial city, places where New York's identity began to form. Beyond them, the city loosened again. North of the settled streets stood the commons. In the early 1700s, this open area lay just beyond the northern edge of the town. It occupied land near today's City Hall Park. The commons was not a landscape space. It was an open field used for grazing animals, public gatherings, and military drills. The ground was uneven and largely undeveloped. This space served multiple functions. Livestock were kept here during the day. Public punishments were carried out nearby. Militia units assembled on the open ground. There were no surrounding buildings at first. The commons marked a clear break between the town and the countryside beyond. Over time, structures began to appear at its edges. In 1735, the city built a new jail near the commons. This structure later became known as the site of the John Peter Zenger trial. Its presence marked the area's growing civic importance. Today, the same ground is City Hall Park. Landscaped lawns and pathways have replaced open fields. The space is enclosed by tall office buildings. In the 1700s, the commons felt exposed. Now, it feels enclosed. From the commons, roads extended northward. These were not streets in the modern sense. They were dirt paths connecting farms and estates. Few were straight. One of these paths would later become the Bowery. In the early 18th century, the Bowery was a rural road. It led to farms once owned by the Dutch. Small houses and barns lined parts of the route. There were no continuous buildings. Large gaps separated structures. Fields and orchards dominated the landscape. Today, the Bowery is a dense urban corridor. In the 1700s, it was countryside. This contrast defined New York at the time. A compact town at the south, open land immediately beyond it. The boundary between city and country was sharp and visible. That boundary was most clearly seen at the water's edge. The shoreline defined early New York. In the early 1700s, Manhattan's southern coastline followed a natural, uneven edge. Small coves and inlets cut into the land. The water reached much farther inland than it does today. The city's eastern shoreline ran close to present-day Pearl Street. On the west, the Hudson River met the land directly at the edge of the settlement. There were no embankments or seawalls at first. Tides rose and fell against wooden docks and earthen banks. Storms frequently damaged waterfront structures. As the town grew, space became limited. By the mid-18th century, New York began altering its shoreline. Wharves were extended outward. Debris, soil, and refuse were used to fill shallow water. This process was slow and uneven. Individual property owners expanded their land one section at a time. There was no unified plan. New streets emerged on newly created ground. What had once been water became usable land. Buildings were constructed on fill that had not yet fully settled. Today, much of Lower Manhattan rests on this reclaimed land. Entire blocks sit where ships once anchored. The original shoreline is invisible. The transformation changed the city's relationship to the water. In the 1700s, the harbor pressed tightly against the town. Now, the city stands at a distance from its original edge. This expansion allowed New York to grow outward before it grew upward. The city's footprint increased long before its skyline did. The shape of modern Lower Manhattan still reflects these early changes. Curved streets and irregular blocks trace the former line of the shore. What appears permanent today was once water. The town was shaped not only by its edge but by its protection. New York's defenses extended beyond Fort George. In the early 1700s, the town relied on a network of smaller fortifications and watchpoints. These structures marked the limits of the settlement and provided early warning of danger. Along the northern edge of the town, watchposts were positioned near major roads. Guards monitored movement into and out of the city. Travelers were inspected, especially during times of unrest. There were no continuous walls by this period. The earlier Dutch wall had been removed. Defense relied on terrain, distance, and the harbor. On the waterfront, small batteries supported Fort George. These were simple earthworks fitted with cannons. They protected vulnerable stretches of shoreline. The city maintained a militia rather than a standing army. Members trained on the commons and assembled when needed. Weapons were stored in armories scattered throughout the town. Today, no physical traces of these defenses remain. Modern buildings occupy their former locations. Street names provide the only clues. Wall Street preserves the memory of the original barrier. Battery Place recalls the artillery positions. The structures themselves are gone. These defenses shaped the city's layout. They defined where streets ended. They influenced where buildings were allowed. They marked the boundary between urban space and open land. As the 18th century progressed, the need for these defenses diminished. The city expanded northward. Former defensive zones were absorbed into the street network. What had once protected New York became part of it. Movement followed. From the northern edge of the town, several main roads led outward. These routes connected New York to the surrounding countryside. They were not paved streets, but dirt roads shaped by use. The most important opening was Broadway. In the early 1700s, Broadway extended north beyond the settled area as a country road. It followed the natural rise of the land. Buildings thinned quickly as one moved away from the town. Houses became scattered. Fences, fields, and gardens appeared between structures. Travel along this road was slow and exposed. Another major route was the Bowery Road. The Bowery led northeast toward farmland and estates. Its name came from the Dutch word for farm. In the 18th century, it passed through open countryside. Small houses, barns, and orchards lined parts of the road. There were no continuous rows of buildings. Most travelers encountered more animals than people. These roads marked the transition from urban to rural space. Leaving the town meant leaving its density behind. The sound of carts and voices faded quickly. Open land began just beyond the last houses. Today, Broadway and the Bowery are among New York's busiest streets. In the 1700s, there were quiet routes leading away from the city. Along these roads stood estates. Wealthy families built country houses north of the town. These estates occupied large plots of land. Gardens, fields, and private lanes surrounded them. One such estate belonged to the Bayard family, another to the Rutgers family. Their lands would later be divided into city blocks. At the time, these properties lay far outside the town center. They were destinations rather than neighborhoods. As New York expanded, these estates were gradually absorbed. Roads were straightened. Land was subdivided. What had once been countryside became streets. Open space remained limited. Public open spaces in 18th century New York were few. Unlike European cities, New York did not begin with formal squares or planned plazas. Most open land existed by necessity, not design. The most important open space remained the commons. As the town expanded northward, the commons became increasingly central. Paths crossed it in multiple directions. Temporary structures appeared along its edges. The space was not enclosed. There were no trees planted in rows, no monuments or formal paths. Its shape shifted over time. Boundaries were informal. Uses changed depending on need. Elsewhere, small greens appeared near churches and public buildings. These were not decorative. They served practical purposes. Churchyards doubled as burial grounds. Unbuilt lots were used for storage or grazing. Open land was always temporary. Planned residential squares, common in London, did not yet exist here. New York's growth was driven by necessity rather than design. Land was divided to maximize use. Buildings filled available space quickly. Only toward the late 18th century did ideas of planned development begin to emerge. Larger parcels were subdivided with some regularity. Straight streets became more common north of the Old Town. These early changes laid the groundwork for later planning. Today, New York contains many formal squares and parks. In the 1700s, open space was rare and utilitarian. The contrast is clear. Where modern New York preserved space intentionally, colonial New York consumed it rapidly. Connection depended on water. Water crossings were essential to New York's survival. In the 1700s, there were no bridges connecting Manhattan to the surrounding land. Movement across rivers depended entirely on ferries. The most important crossing linked Manhattan to Brooklyn. Brooklyn, then known as Brooklyn, was a rural settlement. Farms, small villages, and open land covered the landscape. There was no city skyline on the opposite shore. The ferry operated from the eastern edge of Manhattan. Simple wooden boats carried people, animals, and goods across the East River. Crossings were slow and dependent on weather and tides. On the Manhattan side, the ferry landing was basic. A small dock. Nearby warehouses and taverns served travelers. On the Brooklyn side, the landing opened onto farmland. Dirt roads led inland. Few permanent structures stood near the water. The Hudson River crossings followed a similar pattern. Small ferries connected Manhattan to New Jersey. These routes were less frequent and less developed. They served farmers, traders, and travelers moving between colonies. The rivers defined the city's limits. Manhattan was isolated. Expansion meant building upward or northward, not outward. The water formed a natural boundary. Today, bridges span these rivers. Tunnels run beneath them. Crossings take minutes. In the 1700s, water crossings shaped daily movement. They slowed travel. They limited growth. The opposite shores remained separate worlds. Only later would these spaces merge into a single city. Within the town itself, danger was constant. Fire was a constant threat in 18th century New York. Most early buildings were constructed of wood. Roofs were often shingled. Chimneys were poorly built. Fires spread quickly through narrow streets. Dense construction allowed flames to jump from building to building. Entire blocks could be destroyed in hours. As the century progressed, the city began to respond. After several major fires in the early 1700s, regulations were introduced. New buildings in the town center were increasingly required to use brick or stone. Wooden construction was restricted in certain areas. Brick became the dominant material for houses and warehouses. Walls were thicker. Roofs were heavier and more durable. This changed the city's appearance. Buildings became more uniform in height. Facades were flatter and simpler. Decorative elements were limited. Brick structures also altered street layout. Property lines became more fixed. Permanent buildings replaced temporary ones. Today, very few of these 18th century buildings survive. Later development replaced most of them, but their influence remains. The narrow lots, consistent heights, and street widths of lower Manhattan reflect these early choices. Rebuilding was not centralized. Individual owners rebuilt independently. There was no single architectural style imposed on the city. Practicality guided construction. This process continued through the second half of the 18th century. The city slowly became more permanent, less fragile, more resistant to disaster. What had once been a wooden town began to harden into brick. Growth followed. By the late 18th century, New York began to push steadily north. The compact town at the southern tip of Manhattan could no longer contain its population. Houses spread beyond the commons. Former fields were divided into building plots. New streets appeared. Unlike the winding lanes of the old town, these newer streets were straighter. They followed property boundaries rather than medieval paths. The city began to stretch rather than cluster. By the 1770s, development had reached well beyond today's City Hall Park. Residential buildings lined newly laid roads. Brick construction became more common in these expanding areas. Yet, there was still no unified plan. Each landowner divided property independently. Street widths varied. Blocks were irregular. This lack of coordination created a patchwork city. Some streets ended abruptly, others bent unexpectedly to follow older boundaries. The contrast between old and new was visible. South of the Commons, streets were narrow and crowded. North of it, space opened slightly. Buildings stood farther apart. This period marked the beginning of a new way of thinking. City leaders began to recognize the limits of unplanned growth. As expansion accelerated, the need for order became clear. These early problems would later lead to a radical solution. In 1811, the commissioner's plan would impose a grid across Manhattan. Straight streets, uniform blocks, predictable expansion. But in the 1700s, that future was not yet visible. New York remained divided, an old town at the south, a growing, uncertain edge to the north, and beyond that, open land waiting to be claimed. That order did not endure. Events beyond the city would soon reshape it. The American Revolution left visible scars on New York. In 1776, British forces occupied the city. New York became a military center rather than a civilian town. Ordinary life was disrupted. Buildings were repurposed. Churches became prisons, hospitals, and storage facilities. Large houses were seized for officers' quarters. Warehouses were converted into military supply depots. In September 1776, a massive fire broke out. The fire destroyed nearly a quarter of the city. Hundreds of buildings were lost. Entire neighborhoods south of the Commons were reduced to ruins. Stone walls and brick foundations remained. Wooden upper stories vanished. The cause of the fire was never conclusively proven. Some blamed accidental spread. Others suspected deliberate action. The destruction reshaped the city. Empty lots appeared where houses once stood. Ruined buildings remained unrepaired for years. Temporary structures filled the gaps. British occupation lasted until 1783. During this period, maintenance declined. Streets deteriorated. Public buildings suffered neglect. When British troops finally withdrew, they left behind a damaged city. New York was no longer a colonial town, but it was not yet a modern city. Rebuilding began almost immediately. Property owners returned. Brick construction resumed. Ruined lots were filled. This rebuilding phase would define the city's next chapter. The city entered a new phase. This is New York in the 1780s and 1790s, a city rebuilding itself. After the British evacuation in 1783, New York faced the task of reconstruction. Burned districts were surveyed. Property lines were re-established. Streets were cleared of debris. Brick replaced wood. Fire-resistant materials became preferred. Many new buildings followed Georgian architectural principles: symmetry, balanced facades, simple ornament. The Commons, later renamed City Hall Park, became the Civic Center. In 1789, Federal Hall was rebuilt on Wall Street. This was the site where George Washington took the first presidential oath on April 30th, 1789. The building symbolized the city's brief role as the capital of the United States. Federal Hall stood where the medieval Dutch City Hall once stood. Layers of power built upon the same ground. Nearby, Wall Street remained narrow and enclosed, originally marked by a wooden defensive wall built by the Dutch in 1653. The street retained its compact scale. Low buildings lined both sides. Merchants, brokers, and clerks moved through crowded passages. Trinity Church rose again. The first Trinity Church had been destroyed in the Great Fire of 1776. A second structure was completed in 1790. Its modest spire once dominated the lower Manhattan skyline. From the churchyard, the city extended northward. Fields gave way to houses. Lanes became streets. What had once been countryside began to disappear. This was a walking city. Distances were short. Buildings rarely exceeded 3 or 4 stories. Church spires and public buildings remained the tallest points, yet pressure was building. Population increased. Commerce expanded. The physical limits of the old city became clear. The island demanded order. That order began to take shape. This is New York at the turn of the 19th century, a city organizing itself. As population grew, public institutions expanded. Buildings were no longer only private homes and shops. The city began constructing spaces meant to serve everyone. Markets appeared across lower Manhattan. The Fly Market near the East River became one of the city's most important food centers. Open-air stalls lined wooden sheds. Fish, meat, Grain and produce were sold daily. These markets anchored neighborhoods and determined street activity. Hospitals followed. In 1791, New York Hospital opened on Broadway. It stood north of the dense commercial core, surrounded by open land. The building reflected Enlightenment ideals: order, cleanliness, symmetry. Broadway itself changed. Once a Native American trail, then a Dutch road, it became the city's primary north-south artery. Buildings lined it in stages, pushing steadily northward. Church architecture diversified. Anglican, Presbyterian, Dutch, Reformed, Lutheran, and Jewish congregations built permanent structures. Stone and brick replaced earlier wooden meeting houses. Each building marked a community's presence in the city. Water remained a problem. Wells supplied most households. Public pumps stood at street corners. Contamination was common. Fire risk remained high. To address this, the city began planning larger water systems, though full solutions were still decades away. Meanwhile, burial grounds filled. Churchyards overflowed. Graves were packed tightly. Health concerns mounted. In response, new cemeteries were planned farther from the city center, signaling how far New York was beginning to expand. The city's footprint crept north. What had been farmland in the 1760s became residential streets by the early 1800s. But growth was uneven. Some areas developed rapidly. Others remained open fields, dotted with country houses and taverns. From the Battery at the southern tip to the farms above present-day Canal Street, New York was still a city in transition. Not colonial anymore, not yet modern. That uncertainty prompted a decision. This is New York in the early 19th century, and this is the moment everything changes. In 1811, the city approved a document that would permanently reshape Manhattan. It was called the Commissioner's Plan. The plan proposed something radical: a rigid grid, 12 north-south avenues, hundreds of east-west streets, straight lines imposed across hills, streams, farms, and rock. The island would no longer grow organically. It would be engineered. At the time, most of Manhattan above present-day Houston Street was still undeveloped. Fields, forests, country estates. But on paper, it was already gone. Surveyors began cutting lines through the land. Stone markers were placed. Property boundaries were fixed decades before buildings arrived. What you're seeing here is not a city. It is a blueprint for a future city. Many opposed the plan. Landowners complained that the grid ignored natural features. Hills were leveled. Streams were buried. Ridges were blasted away. But the city moved forward. The grid allowed speed, predictability, speculation. Buildings could now be constructed quickly, repeatedly, efficiently. This decision explains why modern New York looks the way it does. The straight streets, the numbered blocks, the relentless order. What was once landscape became geometry. But a plan on paper is not a city. Its meaning is revealed only when it is built. With the grid in place, construction accelerated. This is New York in the 1820s and 1830s. Rows of houses appear, brick row houses, nearly identical in width and height. Usually 3 or 4 stories, stoop entrances, tall windows, simple decorative lintels. These buildings defined daily life. Families lived above street level. Shops occupied ground floors. Work and home existed in the same structure. Neighborhoods formed block by block. Greenwich Village, Soho, Lower East Side. Each area followed the same grid, but developed different characters. What was countryside only a generation earlier was now continuous street frontage. Churches followed residents north. New congregations built new buildings. Older churches relocated or rebuilt farther uptown. Graveyards moved again. The city was pushing outward faster than ever before, and yet everything was still low. No skyline, no towers, no steel. The city spread horizontally. Its limits were defined by water. Now we return to the edges of the island. The waterfront. Throughout the early 19th century, New York's shoreline was artificial. Land was extended outward using fill. Piers multiplied. Warehouses lined the rivers. Heavy stone structures, thick walls, small windows. Goods moved through these buildings constantly. The East River waterfront became especially dense. South Street emerged as a major commercial corridor. The city smelled of salt, tar, wood, and smoke. This was an industrial landscape. Nothing decorative, nothing monumental, pure function. Many of these buildings would survive into the 20th century. Some still exist today, hidden behind modern facades. This was the engine room of the city. Elsewhere, permanence was being expressed differently. As the city grew, so did its institutions. In 1812, New York City Hall was completed. Built of marble and brownstone, French Renaissance style, it stood north of the old city center, a clear signal of expansion. Courts followed, custom houses, post offices. These buildings were meant to be permanent. Stone replaced brick. Columns replaced stoops. Architecture became symbolic. Power was no longer improvised. It was built to last. In doing so, the earlier city was erased. By the mid-1800s, little remained of 1700s New York. The Dutch city was gone. Colonial houses vanished. Wooden structures demolished. Only street patterns hinted at the past. Wall Street remained narrow. A few churchyards survived. A handful of buildings endured. Everything else was overwritten. The grid marched north. Row houses followed. Industry intensified. The city had outgrown its origins. What had once been a small port town had become something entirely new. Only traces remained. History leaves us fragments. Foundations beneath the streets. Old maps beneath new ones. Buildings repurposed, renamed, reshaped. New York in the 1700s no longer exists, but its outline remains. In the grid. In the waterfront. In the placement of streets and institutions. The modern city stands on the bones of the old one. Frozen moments, rebuilt again and again. Waiting to be seen.